outlining brainstorming, we talked last week about the fact that ideas are cheap. That's not to say they're not important, but you should, as you become a writer, start generating ideas pretty quickly. If you have trouble with ideas, which is actually fairly common, if you're developing good style but you don't quite know what to write about, there are several tricks to use to kind of jumpstart you. One is the ubiquitous writing prompt. Writing prompts are okay. I give them on my podcast, Writing Excuses, because they do work for some people. I have never found that I really like writing prompts that much, because I'm searching for good conflict with which to intersect good storytelling. Really, a book, in my opinion, is about an intersection of three things. At the top, you have your character. The side, you have your setting. And over here you have your plot. And the thing that kind of drives them together with our little super Venn diagram thing here is conflict. Conflict is what's going to drive these stories. You probably heard the little famous adage, the queen died is not a story, but the queen died and then the king died of grief is a story. The reason for that being that the king dying of grief implies more conflict, it implies a question, it implies a relationship. It's a very simple way of putting it, but when I write a book, when I start a book, I am searching for intersections between character and setting that create conflict, or between plot and setting. Plot in this case, I'm talking about your story concept plot. Plot has many definitions. You can define plot as, the stuff that gets you from chapter to chapter, even from paragraph to paragraph. In this definition, it is your one-sentence pitch, okay? Lord of the Rings. This powerful ring was created that could rule the world, and the only person that can destroy it is, an inexperienced furry-footed hobbit who likes to drink tea and doesn't want to walk to the land of death, but has to. Your story hooks, your plot you can kind of describe in one sentence. A better one for that is probably, Frodo traverses the dangerous grounds between the Shire and Mordor. Or, Mistborn. A gang of thieves try to rob the Dark Lord himself. These are your kind of capital P plot, as I sometimes put it. A capital P plot's not going to be enough usually for me. I need an intersection of these things. A gang of thieves to rip off the Dark Lord is fine, but who are these gang of thieves, and where's the inherent conflict in there for them? Why are they doing this? That's where a story starts getting generated for me. And I suggest that's where you start looking. If you're one of those that's a brilliant world builder, of which there will be many in this room, what you need to start doing is start developing characters or plots based around that world building in points of conflict. You generally want to try to put your characters as close to that conflict as possible. One of the biggest rookie mistakes in writing is making an inactive protagonist, okay? This happens because you develop this character and you have them wander into town and see all these problems happening and then want to fix them without giving them a personal attachment to it. Or, you write a teen problem novel, but the teen problem novel is about the girl's friend trying to help her friend get through the problem. Well, that's usually not enough direct personal involvement. It can be if you do it right, but if you do it poorly, it comes off as an outside observer observing the story rather than participating in it. I frequently read new writing where the first chapter is like this. The first chapter involves a main character, a viewpoint protagonist, not actually doing anything, but watching other people do cool things. This is a terrible way to start your book. Even if your book is going to be about, the three-act format, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which is, react, act, being kind of your plot, your movement for your character. It's one of the main ways people build it is at first the main character reacts and then they actually act. This is known as a tangent, kind of the superhero problem. Superman would have nothing to do if bad people didn't force him to do things. and this is a conundrum for writers. A lot of the protagonists will write would be happy, as Frodo was happy, sitting in their house having pleasant afternoons and drinking tea, until the bad guys, who are very active, come in and force them to do something. And this is why we've had this habitual problem in fiction. It's manifest in superheroes a lot, but it's not limited to them, that the villains are more interesting than the heroes. This is because the villains end up acting and the heroes end up reacting. And so your chore as a writer, one of your main chores, is to devise ways that your main protagonist can be proactive even as they are reacting. Okay? This means that you want them to have passions and goals related to the setting, related to other characters, things that are going on that they're working on. Even though maybe the large-scale plot, things are forcing them and forcing their hand and moving them around. Okay? So anyway, that's kind of a tangent, something to keep in mind, that active protagonists are extremely compelling to us. Extremely compelling. We love active protagonists. This is why when you watch a lot of good classic action films, Indiana Jones, the first one's a great example of this, they will often start with a beginning which shows the main character being extraordinarily active before they move into something big, bad has gone wrong, and now you have to react to the situation for a while before you can gain control of it again. We prove how active they are, how they're capable of doing things, and then we kind of take that away from them for a while and watch them struggle back up to it. So, if you are one, getting back to the original supposition here, if you're one that has trouble developing plots, starting off, it's actually pretty easy. Start brainstorming your setting. We'll talk about setting a little bit, probably next week, maybe a little bit today. Start brainstorming your setting. Where's this taking place? What's interesting about it? And start placing characters at the intersection of conflict points. Don't place them observing it. If you have an interesting religion in your world, put your character directly in conflict with it, or as a member of it, directly in conflict with someone else. Inherently, as soon as you start to do that, you will begin to build a story. Because your story, you will start to resolve that in your head or work on it, and suddenly, boom, you have built for yourself a way for your character to go. If that isn't working, another good way to do this is actually read history books. You can find in history lots of great examples of interesting situations. One I usually talk about, is like the marching the elephants over the Alps, right? Hannibal, Alps, elephants. This is a cool concept. You read about this for a while, if you go read about that situation, or maybe the assassination of Sir Thomas of Becket. It wasn't Sir, Saint Thomas of Becket, or things like this. You start reading about some of these cool situations in history, and you can take the core idea of that theme and build another story around it. Maybe yours isn't going to be elephants across the Alps, or even, whatever lizard creatures across the desert. Or it could be, it can be 4 or 5 steps removed. You're going to take your space convoy from this planet to this planet. It's got to pass through a nebula, and you're going to have some of the same hardships. You start kind of with this concept of, here's my conflict. We have to get from here to here, and there's this huge obstacle in the way. Let's look in history and see what kind of complications were involved and see if I can adapt those. Works very well. You will see people doing it all the time. George R. R. Martin wrote an entire book series doing this. He's a medieval historian. He took the War of the Roses. He said, I'm going to do a fantasy version of the War of the Roses, and you have a Game of Thrones. All right? The long-standing tradition of this to get inspiration. It's not cheating or cheap in any way, because what you're doing, if you're doing it right, is you're starting with that as kind of a launch-off point, a springboard, and then you're going to extrapolate. It's kind of like if you've got, in science, you've got this concept of the supersaturated solution, right? And if you drop one little crystal of something in, the whole thing explodes. You're looking for that crystal to start building upon. And that crystal can come from lots of different places.
You're not even the same person that was there before.
So what? Then we got a class in there?
2107.
2107. Mm-hmm.
Everyone gets a chair.
Yeah.
And so the professor who was just leaving,
yes,
whoever he was, he said that his class goes to 5:15.
Uh-huh.
No wonder they couldn't schedule us for the auditorium, right?
Well, they wouldn't anyway, because they don't want us to have a large room.
So you want to risk it?
I want to do, since we're all settled in here right now, I want to do this for an hour. Yeah. Then I want to send someone up to check and see if it's occupied, during the next hour.
That's smart.
And if it's not, then next week we will try starting in that classroom and see what happens.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, tell everybody. I got it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're fine. So, one of the other great methods of doing this, of idea generation, is to look to stories you have loved reading and try and boil them down to what about them you really, really loved. Try and get at their core. There is an issue here. You have to do this delicately. For instance, my suggestion to you is if you love Tolkien, to take a few steps further than it is about elves and dwarves that I love. That's probably not what you actually love about Tolkien. And many newer writers make this mistake. It's like, well, it was his setting, so I'm going to write something very similar to his setting. It probably wasn't that. And it's at its heart that really grabbed you. Maybe after years and years of familiarity and playing D&D and reading books like this, that is what you love. And if that is what you love, then it's fine to write that. Don't not write what you love. But for most people, it's going to be the depth of world building, all of the different songs and things he put into it. It might be that, or it could be the seed, completely opposite that I talked about last week, which is the seed of the common man trying to struggle against this enormous thing that some hero should be in instead of the common man. Maybe it's that which really captured you about Tolkien. Whatever it is, if you can boil it down and develop that, and then say, I'm going to take that as my seed to start my story, you can go a completely different direction with it and use that as kind of your soul of your story. This works very well. If you go see a movie and you say, you know what I love this movie because of X, Y, or Z. You know, I love heist novels. I love heist stories. The Great Train Robbery by Michael Crichton is one of my favorites. The movie Sneakers, one of my favorites. And so I, for a long time, had wanted to do a heist story set in a fantasy world. Taking a genre like that and saying, I'm going to do it set in a science fiction or fantasy world. It's a perfect way to do this. Sorry, I've had I'm getting over a cold, so I'm going to have a scratchy throat today. Usually for me, one idea like that is not enough. And so the reason I didn't write Mistborn for many years is I was looking for a second idea to intersect it with. And I suggest that you try and pack more ideas rather than fewer into your book. For Mistborn, when I got what made me want to write it was the intersection of that idea with a separate idea I've been having, which is the world where the Dark Lord won. If you know the heroic monomyth, Joseph Campbell and all this stuff, then you have someone who went on the hero's journey and actually failed, and then became kind of this dark overlord of the world because of his failure. You know, what if Frodo had kept the ring, or what if Voldemort had killed Harry Potter? This sort of thing, intersecting with the heist novel, created Mistborn for me, and so those two things ramming together were part of my story seed. And you can do this. Oh, do we have someone out there?
Yes, they want me.
They want you.
Of course.
Okay. You can do this and build your story from that. So, if you, how many of you haven't started your novel yet? Yeah, a couple of you. So, not very many of you. This is good. This is good. If you haven't started your novel yet, pick something like this and look for a good area of conflict in it and just start writing. Okay? I don't want you to fall too far behind. You really need to just get on this and explore the concept. Now,
question.
Yes.
Okay. So, like, I might be off on this, but
Yeah.
I was just on your diagram.
Uh-huh.
Okay,
The
so,
lovely and completely
Yes.
non-confusing diagram.
yes, it's beautiful.
Uh-huh.
So, like, I heard you say, like, conflict between, like, character and setting, or,
Yeah.
like...
Character and character, or...
Right.
Yeah.
Can you just give me an example of, like, a conflict between plot and setting?
Conflict between plot and setting? Sure. In a lot of ways, Mistborn has this, because what I'm looking for are these kind of friction points, and conflict between them doesn't necessarily mean they're in conflict with each other. When they rub together, they create friction. For me, the idea was I created this world where the Dark Lord had won, and so I then built off the setting, this horrible setting where ash falls from the sky and things like this. And this is an intersection between between plot and setting in a way that creates a conflict in the world, if that makes sense. And so that's what I was looking for. But another way to do it would be to say something along the lines of, so I have to achieve what? I want to become the greatest swordsman in the world, and then devise something about your setting that says, no, you can't do that. Maybe it's a case system. Your setting involves this rigorous case system, and the person belongs to a case that cannot learn to use a sword. You've created conflict between character and setting right then. Does that make sense? And you've created conflict. Your plot thing could be the story of the sword championships. Sword championships plus conflict built around the concept of people who can't compete in the sword championship are allowed to for the first time this year or something like that. You see what I'm saying? You're just trying to build friction points so that you'll end up having a story to tell. For me, the way that I usually generate books is, and this is only one method, all right? This is one of the tools to stick in your toolbox and see if it works for you. The way that I generate books, you're fine. The way that I generate books is that I am always watching for things that don't even necessarily fit completely into the to the friction section, but fit into the plot or character or the setting section. Meaning, I've got this I get this cool setting idea. I'll use Mistborn again because it's one of my most famous works, and many of you may have read it. But it involves, these misty nights. I drove through a patch of fog at 70 miles an hour and thought it looked cool. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna write that down. That's an interesting visual. It's an interesting setting element. Someday I want to use that in a book. I visited the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. and loved how stained glass windows were lit up at night, shining out into the darkness and onto things out there. And I thought, wow, if I combine that with the misty nights, you've got these beautiful, radiant lights shining out into mist and making these patterns that from a distance will just look like these glowing balls of light of various colors. That's a great image. I'm going to save that. And I'm going to slowly, what I do is over time, slowly combine ideas until I build a story. It's almost like, to use another science metaphor, I was a chemist my first year at BYU. It's like a molecule being built, right? Where things are reacting, and you've got your thing, and your thing here, and your thing here, and your thing here, and they slowly are like building chains with all these ideas working together, and then they start to make links like this and things, and suddenly you've got this cool story where different things are creating links, conflicts, or relationships in ways that slowly grow into a novel. When I have enough of these, then I usually sit down and I make for myself a book guide. This is a document where I open it up, Microsoft Word. I open up the document map on the side, which I like, and I say, plot, setting, character. And I highlight all of these as heading number 1, and then I write down these with the relationships kind of underneath them on here as my starting points as kind of my subheadings. Setting, we've got misty nights. We've got ash falling from the sky. Plot, we've got a gang of thieves trying to overthrow the Dark Lord. We've got character. We've got this guy who was once a kind of gentleman thief who was out for himself. Then something terrible happened in his past, and now he's out kind of more for revenge. He doesn't want to just rob the Dark Lord. He wants to topple him completely, though he's using the robbery as a method to kind of get everyone else on board. Each of these things were developed separately. These characters were developed separately in most cases, and then interwove and connected, and I build my setting guide out of that. Okay?
Do you typically write down these ideas as they occur to you?
Often I do. This is my little writer's notebook sort of thing I carry around. Here's a gummy bear. You asked a question. Oh, you asked one too, didn't you? Yeah. Woo.
I like red.
You do? Oh, okay. I usually write them down. I actually have a document on my computer I call cool stuff that has to be used sometime. And actually, what I usually do is once I've done this, I open up the cool stuff document, and I go through and see if anything else fits in here. Kind of more trying to make some of these connections. And I try out different things on here. From there, I start brainstorming to fill it in. Okay? And this is where I devise things. I've spoken about before at Mistborn, there are 3 magic systems. Allomancy, Feruchemy, Hemalurgy. Allomancy and Feruchemy were developed differently and distinctively for different books. I eventually started writing this one to have Allomancy. I pulled Feruchemy from the cool things that need to be used sometime because it worked really well with Allomancy in an interesting way. And then I needed a third one for the plot structure that I was building, and so I developed Hemalurgy rather than kind of letting it come more organically at that point and put it into the story because this thing's going to have holes in it. And so my process then is to fill in the holes by patching them, by brainstorming, by figuring out what needs to happen. And I do a lot of reworking here, and that is where my book guide comes from. Usually, this is the most extensive, first off, for me. Okay? Character, I'll have 1 or 2 lines about everybody with their major passions and conflicts, but I won't go too far into who they become, because as I said, I tend to discover and write my characters, and I'll need to try them a few times before I know who they are. At this point, my next step is the plot. I plot backward and then write forward. And so under here, these are my plot brainstorms. This is really my outline. And with my outline, I then start with the cool things I want to have happen in the book. Awesomeness trumps almost everything for me. I can find a way to make something work if it's awesome. That's one of my secrets. Perhaps I shouldn't admit that. I should be like, oh, no, it's all, no. I make it awesome first, and then I make it make sense. I can do that because I'm developing everything, sort of free form here where I can change things. If I come up with a great idea, I'm going to take it. I'm not going to say, oh, that won't work. Now, once I've written the book, sequels I have to throw away sometimes, ideas that might be awesome, because at that point I've given myself canon, and consistency sometimes trumps minor amounts of awesomeness. All right? As fun as it would be to add some crazy new thing into the Mistborn world, it usually isn't going to be appropriate because at that point I've got consistency. But if that becomes a problem for you, that's a good problem to have because it means you're getting published and people are reading your books, and then you have to worry about canon. Okay? So that's not a big deal for most of you. Yet. It will be a big deal for all of you. Yes, go ahead.
So, okay. Really terrible at catching.
That's all right.
I feel like, okay.
Notice how I give you a new one to the one I've been squishing my fingers? I'm such a good teacher.
By setting, you're saying it's most extensive, but do you mean you're getting city names and
No, naming stuff is not important.
Right.
Don't waste your time too much on naming stuff.
Okay, that's what I thought. So you mean more like a general
the atmosphere and feel.
Level of technology.
Yes, this is the level of technology.
Environment.
We'll do an entire day on this. But yeah, that also cultural setting, the religions, the governments, the history, these kinds of things. I kind of divide setting really, and we'll talk about this, into 2 categories, which is kind of the physical setting and the cultural. This is the stuff that would exist with or without the people getting involved, and this is the stuff that the people create. And one thing to keep in mind as an aside about setting, different books have different focuses, and with setting, don't think you have to do it all, okay? Even Tolkien didn't do it all, and he took 20 years building a setting. For one book, you may need a very distinctive set of languages, because your story is about the differences between these cultures in part, and their interacting and their conflict between their different ways of thinking. You'll need to have very distinctive naming styles for the different cultures, and you'll want to have some work built into the languages and things like that. For another book, the culture may be homogeneous. You may have just basically one taking place in one city, and yeah, you'll have some little cultural influences, but it's mainly people from the same culture. If you're writing, for instance, a Regency fantasy, they're basically going to have one, culture. You're going to have a cast of 12 instead of a cast of 500. They can all come from the same culture. You don't spend your time then building all the different kingdoms around that are not going to really interact. Don't spend your time there. In some books, you will want to world build the religions very deeply. In other books, you'll want to world build the science very deeply. In other books, you can ignore that because they aren't points of conflict, and they aren't, your book is not going to live or die on them. And that point, I would not build them ahead of time very much. Whatever your comfort level is, but you only need to be, vaguely aware of these things. It'd be nice in your Jane Austen book to know what the other kingdoms are and the kind of the relationships. But, we're talking like 2 or 3 hours worth of brainstorming rather than 2 or 3 weeks worth of brainstorming for that sort of thing. So, my outline. I build my outline backward. I build my outline by starting with the coolest moments, the most powerful character moments, the most powerful plot moments. Usually they're big plot moments, but other times they're actually scenes that I think will fit into this book. And I start with these, and then I work backward in my plot, saying what do I need to have happen before this can occur in a way that's very that's fulfilling. So if you are writing a romantic subplot, and you have 2 characters, and of course then your big moment is when they profess their love for each other and get together, right? The hookup. If your end thing is the hookup, then you will say, okay, what do I need to have happen? What are my list of occurrences before we can have that moment? What things will make this moment more powerful? What things will make it really shine? What things, what problems need to happen first? And I will actually world build those, or outline those backward, and then work forward, okay? When I write my book, I work forward. Now, the thing about this is, I usually have about a dozen of these different things with bullet points underneath them in my outline. My outline is not this happens and this happens. It is, here is this subplot, and here are a bunch of things, the things that need to happen for this subplot to work. And here is this thing, and we'll do a whole day on plotting, so don't worry too much about this right now. But the idea is that when I'm going to write a scene, I'll grab the next bullet point in this one, and, we've got this mystery plot over here, the next thing revealed here, and I'll kind of shake them up together, devise what the best setting and viewpoint will be, and then I'll write the scene achieving those goals. So I'm a goal-based writer. Another way to view this is the points on the map philosophy. Some writers have described it as, I know I'm starting in San Diego, I'm driving to Washington, D.C. That I know. Now, where do we want to visit along the way? Well, I'm pretty sure I want to go here, and here, and here, just on my travels. All right, so these are my points on my map. Let's then fill in these parts, and make them interesting. That is one way that people write books. I'm not going to draw a map of the United States, because then you would know how horrible an artist I am. And it's better for you to imagine that. Imagine me being a terrible artist. So, questions there. Questions about how to start and how to brainstorm, how to begin working on your story. Yes.
So for these different subplots that
Yes.
you have like the hookup and then the mystery
Yeah.
story. Do you just have like a big list of these, and then you, as you're going along, you're like, oh, I need to progress this thing, and so you go and just check it off?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's basically it. And I get an instinct for which ones I need to do next.
Okay.
How do you know what won't work when you're brainstorming?
You don't always. A lot of experience, a lot of practice. Generally, it's worth giving a try. Some pitfalls you can fall into. Sometimes, now I say you want to have lots of ideas, but you do want your lots of ideas to work together in good ways, to be kind of somewhat cohesive. I do run into new writers occasionally who kind of have the everything and the kitchen sink philosophy. which is like they're trying to write 4 books at once, and they can't decide which book they want it to be. That can be a problem. The difficulty there is you have to kind of diagnose those separately, because I would say 7 out of 10 writers don't put enough ideas in, and then 3 other writers, if they had 7 out of 10 who have a problem with this. The other 3 are stuffing in everything in the kitchen sink, and they're like, I'm gonna write a paranormal romance, also a Regency, that's also this, that's also, you're going to have space penguins, and it's all going to take place in an alternate dimension, and they're all characters in a book, but they don't know it, and the book is being written, and they become self-aware, and boom! So there is a fine balance to be had between streamlining and making sure things are cohesive enough, and also filling your story with enough ideas that it's interesting to talk about for you.
How much do you talk with other people about the ideas when you're like brainstorming for your books before you, or like compared to writing? Do you talk to people a lot? Or just writing?
Most of the time I'm doing it without talking to people. Once in a while I will brainstorm with people on a larger project or something like that. But usually it's just me. The thing is, that's going to be very situational depending on how you work. I have people in my writing group that thrive on, here's this idea, kick back to me the different ways it could go, so I can like have all of these and juggle them and then decide how I really want to tell my story. All right.
Later on, once you became a...
Hey, these are your gummy bears. I'm going to throw you one of your gummy bears back. Yeah.
So
Hey, I almost beamed her.
once you began to consider yourself a professional writer, how important was your writing group to you? I mean, is it still as important to you now as it was back when you were still like in our position?
I would say for me it is. I tend to write very quick first drafts, relatively. Quick meaning, writing the last Wheel of Time book took me a year. That's quick for a book of its length in the business. It's not like I'm writing in a weekend, but I tend to write very quick, relatively clean first drafts because I do plot my outline and my world fairly extensively. However, because of that, I usually have medium level, chapter level problems that I don't spot because I'm not reworking it and going over the possibilities and plausibilities as much as someone who's maybe a discovery writer that kind of really thinks their way through as they're going. And so my writing group, they're not generally picking out large-scale problems with my book. They're usually giving me chapter by chapter. In this chapter, I think you really forgot this, or in this chapter I was confused here, or what about this sort of things that are very useful to me.
How do you balance writing and researching? Like if you have your plot points,
Right.
I find that I get so distracted with researching that I
Right.
don't get to writing.
How do you balance writing with researching? I keep my direct research to a minimum until I finish my first draft, because I've found that that's the case there. You can't always do this, but a lot of times you'd be surprised. You can write something. For instance, in a recent book I did, The Way of Kings, I had a character who was the son of a surgeon, and I wanted him to be a really good field medic. He's a soldier, and he's been applying what his father taught him to field surgery. I'm not a field surgeon. I don't know a lot about this. I wrote the book, and in those scenes I would even say things like, he makes it better. And then I went and researched after the fact when I was sure I wanted this to be my character's, one of my themes for the character, because, there's no way of telling if I'll even end up using all of that, or what I'll specifically need to know. And then I get to the situation, I'm like, all right, this is the wound. I can figure out how to make this better with minimal resources for him. And usually with research I've found that you can get yourself, and that by doing that method, if you do like the base minimum research ahead of time, so a little bit of reading here and there to not sound completely like an idiot. Then after the fact, do enough research to get yourself 70% of the way there, and then give it to an expert for the other 30%, which is what we did with Way of Kings. We found a surgeon and said, here, read these scenes and tell me what I did wrong. And he fixed the little things that from there I would have had to have spent. It's like this kind of parabolic scale where, with I did that backwards, didn't I? Maybe I did. With if this is amount of time you have to spend and this is how much you learn, if you stop here, you're getting much more learning for the amount of time spent. And this is the most effective up front, and then you can kind of do this amount. This amount would take so much more time that you just then give it to an expert, and it's in enough of a state that they can fix it for you. Does that make sense? This is the method I found to be the most useful. That said, I do know writers that the research is what gets them into the story and gives them brainstorming necessary to write their book. They go read about a period in the medieval era, and that gets them really excited. I think this is how Connie Willis does it. Gets really excited about an era, reads for a year in that era, and then can sit down and write this brilliant book, and that's their process. That is not my process. My process is I like to have control over the story. I'm not usually drawing as much from research. I'm using the research as a tool to enhance a story I already want to tell, rather than looking to the research for a story I want to tell. Okay? Right here.
How many of these do you juggle at one time? Do you only work on one, or do you have like two?
I write... did I give you one? I didn't, did I? Woo! I should throw one at the camera so that they can feel they're part of the class. Here you go. Yeah, don't leave those on the floor because I don't want people to step on them. But someone else can eat it if you don't want to eat it, or it went on the floor and that's bad. But you're college students. You're eating food off the floor. I'm sure you are. It's the law of being in college. If it's free, you eat it. It doesn't matter if you like it or not or where it's been. I usually am writing new material on one book at a time, revising a separate book, and planning a separate book. That's the maximum I can do. Often I'm only doing one of the three, but at times I'm doing all three. I'm very rarely, if ever, writing 2 books at once.
So do you create one of these and decide you don't want to write it right now and then do a different one?
Sometimes, but more likely, I've got this thing that I'm tweaking for one, while I'm finishing the end of another. I'm starting to fill in because at this point, I've written 80% of the book and the other 20% is really well plotted at that point in my head. So there's not much brainstorming left to do. It's just a matter of getting it on the page. At that point, some of the brain space that had been devoted to that can start moving over to brainstorming the next book.
Do you use this whole same process for your Alcatraz novels?
No, my Alcatraz novels are free written books. And so, let's talk about other methods of building stories. Now, I believe I mentioned the Kevin J. Anderson method, which is the start and write out a really detailed description of your book, and then you take that and you take it one step and you put it into viewpoint, and then you take that and you take it one step further and do a more detailed outline, and then finally you write the scenes where you take each kind of paragraph and say this is a scene and write your book. I've never tried that method before, but I do know many authors who use it. The method I use for the Alcatraz books is I say is somewhat like you guys seen that show Whose Line Is It Anyway?
Yeah.
It's like Whose Line Is It Anyway? With the Alcatraz books, my goal with the books is, number one, they're only one viewpoint books. Number of viewpoints you're going to use magnifies the complexity of your book many-fold, all right? For new writers, I suggest try and stick to 2 or 3 viewpoints maximum. If you're writing a YA book, do 1 or 2, okay? If you're doing epic fantasy, maybe let yourself have 4, but remember something like, The Wheel of Time. Big, massive, epic scope. The first book was halfway through before it added a second viewpoint, because the complexity of the world is so big that adding a lot of different viewpoints right off the bat can just make things explode for you. So as an early writer, I once said, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to use 12 main characters, and they're all going to have their own cool plots and be doing different things. The book was a disaster. Okay, so that's a little aside. The idea here is that if, I don't want to say don't be ambitious, because you want to be ambitious, but if you think about it this way, And I will get to the answer to this, how to do Alcatraz books. But if you think of it this way, you think of, let's say your writing skill is right here, on some arbitrary scale. This is where you are. And if you shoot for a book that's like right here in your skill level, the book is going to turn out, how's it going to turn out whether if you shoot for one like this? And let's say you were going to write these two hypothetical books. This one turns out just wonderfully, even though it's in smaller in scope, and this one turns into a train wreck. This one is going to be a better book, even though you may look at that and say, oh, but it's less ambitious, it's less complex. Well, sometimes taking the thing that's just challenging you enough to make it really interesting, yet not so grand in scope that it's going to train wreck, can actually step your skill level up a bit. It's like saying, let's say that you weigh 120 pounds, you're like, I'm going to go fight in the heavyweight division because that's where the real champions are. Well, no, it's, you can, there are fantastic books of small scope. Pride and Prejudice is a very small scope book. It's a wonderful novel, okay? There's, you don't look at Pride and Prejudice and say, well, yes, but, it doesn't have the cast that something like Game of Thrones has. They're doing completely different things. And so it's not, even though, the number of viewpoints might make this one more ambitious, this one is an equally good or better book, in my opinion, because of what it's trying to achieve and how well it achieves it. And so saying, I'm not saying don't be ambitious, but I am saying sometimes it's best to try and look and say, I'm going to write a really great book at this level ambition rather than write a mediocre book at this level ambition until I get better. I say that because of personal experience. This helped me become a better writer when I kind of stepped it up. The books that I tried at this level of ambition when I was a newer writer really turned out to be horrible, and I didn't learn as much as the books like Elantris, which Elantris is a smaller scope ambition book than something like Way of Kings. And yet there are plenty of people that like Elantris more because ambition is not the only thing that makes a good book. It's only one factor of many that can make for a good book. All right? So keep that in mind. So with Alcatraz, only having one viewpoint means that I don't have to worry about the detailed plot outline as much because, our scale of complexity is going to remain relatively simple. One direct plot line. It's going to be sequential and chronological. We're not going to do time jumps and things like that, which add a lot of complexity. And I'm going to kind of only have 2 or 3 set-piece scenes, meaning we're going to be in this location, and then this location, and then maybe this location. So what that allows me to do is to do to write the books much more free-form for me. So what I do with them is I sit down and I say, okay, I'm going to give myself the grab bag brainstorming session. I'm going to take just a couple of days. I'm going to brainstorm just wacky, screwy, interesting things that make me laugh. Sorry about that. You've been warned. That make me laugh, and then I am going to try and write a book where they all make sense. Okay? So I'll sit down and say, okay, we're going to come up with new smedgery talents. If you haven't read the books, these are books about people who have their magical powers are stupid things that people do, like, one person's magically good at arriving late to appointments, and, another person's magically good at tripping, stuff like that. I'm going to brainstorm cool lenses. Lenses, they have magical glasses that do cool things. And then I'm going to come up with random elements. Kind of like, in Whose Line, they'll draw it and say, okay, tell a story using a tangerine and, a wet noodle. This is what I'll do. I'll be like, okay, talking dinosaurs. And a bad guy made of little pieces of metal. And, all of these random things, I'll end up taking about 2/3 of them, saying, okay, I've got to tell a story with all of these elements that feels cohesive, it makes sense. Go! Oh, and it has to be funny. And then I'll just go, chapter by chapter, and see and try and get these things all in and hit all these points by the end of the story. It's a real fun writing method. It creates for a lot of spontaneity, but it also is very silly. So it's most suited to a middle grade type book. The reason for that being, the older we get, the more we want our silliness and our seriousness separated, it seems to be. while a middle grade kid will read an action adventure book with a lot of silliness and still enjoy it as a serious book. It's harder to pull that off unless you're Terry Pratchett for adults. It really is. And that's why you end up with something more like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is really crazy, but really does not have anything in the way of compelling characters or a compelling plot. It's just humor. In saying just humor, I mean, it's brilliant. It's great humor, but it is just humor. It's not doing a lot of things. Pratchett somehow manages to take it and have a good plot and some decent characters and the humor together. He's the only one I've read that can do that. But anyway, if that's your bag, then go for it. But remember, for adults, generally, humor is not random elements mixed together the way it is for kids. Taking, if I write in an Alcatraz book, my penguins are on fire, they laugh. They're like, why do you have penguins and why are they on fire? That's hilarious. That's not generally going to be as funny for adults. Adults are going to be looking for wordplays or dramatic irony or these types of humor that are not as well suited to this kind of random brainstorming thing I do for Alcatraz. Okay? So, question for you guys. Have you used other methods of kind of generating a story and getting started that I haven't talked about? If so, tell me about them, and let's talk about them with the class. I'll give you a gummy bear. Yeah.
I once had a friend who was trying to encourage me to write, and so she said,
I shouldn't
why don't
cough
you
on
tell
my
me a
hands
story?
and touch gummy bears.
It was on Facebook. She said, why don't you tell me a story? So I just told her a story, and then she was like, oh, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more.
Yeah.
So it was basically a free write, but it was because I had an audience.
Right.
I knew when she was excited and what would bore her and stuff.
Okay, considering audience. That can be very useful. I just talked about that a little with the Alcatraz books. And we will talk about the different genre divisions. In fact, maybe we'll talk about that today, because that is kind of on my list of things to talk about. But yeah, considering audience. What else do we got? I'm going to throw your gummy bear with this hand that I didn't cough on.
Awesome. How I wrote just the one novel, for some reason it was Christmas Eve, and I just thought of this really engaging dialogue, and I said, I have to write this down.
Okay.
And then I just started asking those questions, going back with the plot, basically. Well, what brought them to this point? And I just kept going, and I wrote a novel out of that.
Awesome. I once challenged followers of me on Twitter to do a dialogue exercise, which is very fun, which is try to write a story with 3 or more characters in which you use no dialogue tags. A scene, not really a story. In which you use no dialogue tags, but which you differentiate each character by the way they speak. And that could be, if you're having trouble starting, a good way to go. Say, I'm gonna come up with 3 characters. I'm gonna come up with different ways that they talk. Not necessarily dialect. Dialects, dialect, yes, but not like Cockney accent dialect that you write on the page. Not Mark Twain type dialect, but more, this person favors compound sentences, or this person always uses, Robert Jordan does this, fishing metaphors. It's a woman from a fishing background, and even though she's like one of the most powerful women and most cultured women now, she always uses fishing metaphors, and it's great because she'll start using these complex fishing metaphors that no fisherman would ever come up with. But they're still about, chopping off the fish head as being a metaphor for, And so that's a great way to characterize someone just through dialogue. And you could do something like this, build your characters so they each have a different way of talking. Maybe one of them uses, very direct, blunt speech, and the other one always tries to talk around things and placate everybody. Building a dialogue exercise that way. What else you guys used? Yes, right here.
I usually come up with the character first and then decide what's wrong with them and figure out how they're going to fix that.
Excellent. Woo, that was awful. Sorry about that throw. Okay, what's wrong with them? How to fix it? That's a great way. One of the tools I've seen people use that I like is also the what does the character want most, and why can't they have it?
Let's see. One I use not very often, but just kind of making my dreams make a little bit more sense.
Okay, dreams. Sure, works fine. Yes.
I have younger siblings who are quite a bit younger than me.
And
they like to draw funny pictures, and I'll just say, what is that? What does it do? Where does it go?
Okay.
How does it work? And by the time we're done, we've written a short story together.
Excellent. Was there one back here?
I was actually going along the same lines with the.
So give him a bear coming at you.
Like that amplifies creativity quite a bit.
Sorry, I missed it. What was it?
I was actually just going along with what he had
Oh,
said
yeah.
about a dream journal.
Yeah, dream journals are great. Okay, right here, and then over here, and then we'll go on to something else.
I actually, one of the things that happened to me recently was, oh dear.
You're fine. It's under your feet. You'll get it in a minute.
So I had recently a original character idea from a dream, and
Uh-huh.
fortunately, I forgot 99% of the plot in the dream, so I could just rewrite everything.
Dream journals are good, though. Dream journals are useful. All right, who was the last person? You were the last person.
Just the one that, or the novel that I'm writing right now for this class. It came up with, I was listening to some music and I wanted to put a story to it.
Oh, okay. That's excellent. In fact, I do that a lot. When on my points on the map thing, my big, powerful scenes are often come from listening to music while I'm working out and devising something to go there. Okay, I'm going to eat this one because it's red, and you're getting the orange one. Sorry. I'm the teacher. I can do that. Let's talk a little bit about genre, nature of genre, as it comes to understanding audience. This is kind of I don't usually do this till later in the year, but this will be good. I found more and more that learning to consider audience is a very useful thing for a writer to come to understand, particularly if they're writing for children. Remember, children goes up to 18, 19 in the publishing world. Start using the terminology that they use in publishing, by the way. So to start thinking of a professional, start talking in word counts, don't talk in page counts. Because page counts can change very easily. So start talking at word counts, and nowadays the standard is just to use the Microsoft Word count. It used to be, count the, format and this format and that, has an average page, words per page of this, yada, yada. They don't use that anymore because we can just push a button, and now we get a word count, and so we use that. Yeah, so genre. Why is genre important to consider? Well, it is important to consider because genre will really help you place where you're going to market your book and place, even writing your book, certain decisions you might make. The thing to keep in mind is there are no rules, okay? There are guidelines that make a book more publishable or less publishable by the standards. Every book is going to break some of these, okay? The thing to do is to know what they are so that you can choose which ones are important to you in your story so you can break them wisely. All right? So, we'll start talking about length, okay? Length. On the short end of what we do in this class is what we call a middle grade novel, all right? A middle grade novel is a novel targeted. Scholastic targets theirs as young as 8. That's about the bottom of where you can go for middle grade, and it goes up to 13 or 14 at its maximum. The sweet spot for middle grade is 6th, 7th grade. Okay? So, middle grade novels. Middle grade novels have, unless you have an established name, generally have a maximum of 55K words. Okay? Around 50, 55. You can break this, but break it knowingly that this is a pretty hard one to bust out of, okay? They're pretty strict on this. The reason for this is they like to keep them short to grab the attention span of as many kids at this age as possible. They want to be able to use large print and make the book feel like it's reading really quickly, okay? Feeling like it's reading really quickly is an important thing in publishing these days for whatever reason. They like, in certain genres, you to really feel like you're tearing through this book to give you a sense that the book is a real page-turner, okay? We don't do this in epic fantasy. But they love it in thrillers. In fact, if you go and you pick up your average, what's his name? Alex Cross books. What's that guy? He writes like a book a month. James Patterson. If you go look at your average James Patterson and then compare it to your average book in the science fiction fantasy section, you'll find that the pages on his are like this. Like Whereas over here, we're like that. Okay? You'll distinctly notice it. They have wider margins, larger print, more leading, space between the lines. And when you pick up that book, you really do tear through it because it's deceptively short. Okay? Or deceptively long, I guess is how you'd say it, because of that. They do like to do the same thing in middle grade when they can. All right? So, middle grade is 55K. What is middle grade? Middle grade, generally, in our genres, are the whimsical stories. All right? Not always, but usually they are often the leave our world and go to another world kids sucked into Fantasyland are often middle grade. That's not the only thing that happens, but that's a common theme in middle grade. They are the fun adventure. Often they can be in school or not, but more often they're not in school. There are some that do take place in school. Whimsical. They tend to be third person, but not always. I'd say they're third person like 60% of the time, maybe 65. I don't know. What else? Is anyone else here a children's fiction major? They can or taking classes from some of the children's writers. They can steer me a little bit better here. Do I pretty much have it down?
They usually stick to one viewpoint.
One viewpoint. Yeah, you're right.
And
right.
a pretty simple plot.
Yeah. Simple plot. In fact, one way to visualize the simple plot is that most of them you read take place in like one day. That's very common. Okay? One day, or, that's not always the case, but it's a way to keep things simple. You're like, this is an adventure that happens this day.
Or this summer.
Or this summer. That happens pretty frequently too. I'm saying this, though Harry Potter was a whole semester, and the first Harry Potter book was very much middle grade, kind of straight down the line on a lot of these things.
I'm noticing a lot of them, like, the characters don't really need deep moral reasons for doing things.
Yeah, they're not deep moral reasons, they're having fun. Yeah. So some great examples of this. Fablehaven. Great example of this. And the book that was kind of inspired by, what is it, that fairy monsters book that they made a movie out of it. Spider-Man Chronicles. First Harry Potter book. What are some other ones that aren't the... What's that? Chronicles of Narnia are a great example of this. How about some ones that are not kids sucked into Fantasyland, but are still genre?
Guardians of the Hulu.
Okay.
Ranger's Apprentice.
Ranger's Apprentice. I haven't read those, so I don't know for sure.
You've got Entwined, and you've got Magic Treehouse books, you've got
Yeah,
Wimpy Kid
the
books.
thing about... No, Wimpy Kid and Magic Treehouse are probably the age one step younger.
Oh, are they?
Yeah, probably. Banicula is also probably one step younger than middle grade. Those are the books that are actually like 15,000 words. You can read them in like a couple hours. Those are like chapter books. Middle grade is not chapter books. Middle grade is targeted at the kids who are done with chapter books but aren't quite ready for YA. But anyway, let's talk about YA then. YA is a larger genre. It generally goes 13-ish up to 19-ish. Your upper limit for middle grade for YA is a lot more loose, but people tend to say they want 75K words as a starting point. Twilight was 120, and it still got published. That's the biggest one I've heard of recently. From a new author that, but it does happen. But 75 or 80K, they are usually very frequently at school. Not always, but very frequently. Why would that be? Why would the middle grade ones take place in Adventure and Fantasyland, and in YA, Fantasyland comes to school?
Because that's what their life revolves around.
That's what their life revolves around?
They're becoming a little more realistic and less head in the clouds.
Yeah, perhaps. Yep.
They want more of an escape from their regular life.
Perhaps. I don't know. I'm just.
I feel like when you're younger, like school's like, yay, school, and then when you're like YA, you're like, that's where all your problems are.
Right. It's where it's the conflict. School is conflict. It's where the Hi.
Isn't that a lot to do with adults too?
Yeah.
Oh
yeah, we left out one big thing. We did.
You can escape being adults by going to fantasy land.
Yeah.
You don't when you go to school.
Yeah. Do you want to come in and sit down?
Oh well, there are so many people. We were just sitting out in the hall. We're listening.
Really? How many of you
just-
are there?
Well, there's 3 of us.
Okay. All right. We could make room for you guys if we want to. One thing I forgot about middle grade, and this is huge. I can't believe I forgot this. Big difference between middle grade. Where do kids get books if they're middle grade kids? They're given to them by adults. Okay? Given by adults. If they're going to school library, they're often being pointed to a book. And so these middle grade books are, the librarians are so influential. They're still very influential in YA, but they're so influential here. The parents are buying the kids' books here. YA kids are where they start buying them themselves. Or they're choosing them themselves, or they're picking the books distinctly because these are the books that they don't think that they would be told to read. Okay? That changes everything. All right? Despite what you may think, YA, or middle grade, edited for content. YA is not edited for content. Now that's going to change based on which imprint and you're going with and what their reputation is. Disney imprint is going to edit for content, but because it's a YA book does not mean they're going to edit for content. In fact, they're likely not to because the kids are in a rebellious stage. The kids want to read things that feel edgy. Edginess is big.
Hunger Games?
Yes. I don't know how to spell edginess. Edginess is big. Tithe is an example out of here. Tithe is a book by Holly Black, which she was one of the Spiderwick Chronicle writers. Tithe has the F word. It has pretty graphic sex. All of these things. Parents are like, but it's a kid's book. YA is not edited for content. Okay? Just understand that. You don't have to write that. You can be edgy in a different way. Twilight is edgy too. To a YA audience. But just to understand that that's how the industry tends to view these things. It's not going to be the case for all publishers. That said, I've never had a publisher come and say, oh, you need to add X, Y, or Z into your book. They look to what the book is trying to achieve. And some books are going to try to achieve this level of super edginess like Tithe was doing, and other books are not going to. But Hunger Games is a great example. Hunger Games is an edgy book, okay? That's a brutal novel. And that's a YA book, all right? So, in middle grade, one thing to keep in mind is adults are useless. Okay? Adults are useless. This is a recurring theme. You don't have to do it, but almost all of them, they're useless. Anyone read Series of Unfortunate Events? Middle grade books. Adults are useless. How useful are the adults in Harry Potter? Not very. Particularly in the middle grade era. Harry Potter becomes YA. And you'll notice something about Harry Potter as Harry Potter becomes YA. It becomes edgier. It becomes the conflicts stop being whimsical kids in Fantasyland, and they start being the big YA trope of boys/girls. Okay. There are some things. Oh, we've got a chair.
Yeah, I have to go because I'm not feeling well.
Okay.
Can you tell my group that I sent them an email?
Okay. Group, he sent you an email. We'll see you next week. Make sure you submit for next week, all right?
I will.
Okay.
Probably that gummy bear yay.
Yeah, probably that gummy bear. From the floor. Boys and girls, okay? Boys and girls is huge in YA. It's barely touched on in middle grade, okay? Yes?
You mean like
the literature distincts between boys and girls, or like it's targeted to boys?
No. I'm talking more about the idea of boys noticing girls, girls noticing boys. That. Well, yeah. I mean, again, J.K. Rowling is a brilliant writer, and their main focus of her brilliance is her understanding of children. All right, and you can see as the books become YA for middle grade, you can see exactly a lot of the things we're talking about. She transitions her books into that, and it works very well. So, angst. Did I spell angst right? Angst. That's the big thing in YA. Problem novels. You know what I mean by problem novel?
No.
I have bulimia, but it's my secret thing that I'm not going to tell anybody about, and I'm going to struggle with it, and it's so hard. I shouldn't make fun of, it's a real thing, but there are so many I have bulimia books. They're called teen girl problem novel books. And they are targeted at, I have depression, I have this, I have that. These are all YA things. They don't do that as much in middle grade. So, am I missing anything here?
Do adults and parents become more like the problems?
Yeah, that's what I was going to do that. Yeah, parents are useless, and YA adults are the problem. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Adults are untrustworthy. You don't have to do any of this, ULTS. And so you can kind of see like the difference between so Spider Chronicles versus like Percy Jackson's over here, right? And you can kind of see why those two books. And so these are guidelines for if you're kind of looking at where you're going to target your book. Shannon Hale has kind of an interesting story that she tells where she took the Goose Girl and was targeting it at adult fantasy publishers, and she didn't get it published until she sent it to Bloomsbury, Harry Potter's publisher, and they said, "Oh, this is a YA book. We're going to move the protagonist down 2 years in age, and we're gonna release it as a YA novel." And so knowing your target audience for your book can be very helpful for these kinds of reasons. Usually, I would say, write the book that you want to write and throw aside anything that gets in the way. However, if the book you want to write is going to work equally well if you do one of these things or not, then doing one of these things that makes it more in line with kind of what works in that genre that you're shooting for is usually a really good idea. Does that make sense? So, let's jump into the adult genres. Do note that there are several epic fantasy YA. I think Ranger's Apprentice probably fits in that. I haven't read it, though. Just from looking at its packaging, it might actually be a middle grade. And that's because, fantasy bleeds young. It also bleeds old. And so back in the old days, when I was growing up, my schools, we'd started to see YA divisions appearing around, but they hadn't hit Nebraska yet. And so my library had children's division and adult division. There was no YA division. YA came about as a division because people started realizing teens didn't want to go into the children's section to get books. That can be another thing to divide the two in your mind. The middle grade kids don't mind running over into the children's section to get their books. They look in the independent reader section. They're happy going in the children's section. They still, they may not be as interested in the toys, but they don't feel offended that they're still kids. Because, they're like, yay, kids club, we're kids rule. As soon as they say, I'm not a kid, they're YA. For most kids. And that's one of the big dividing lines. And so they took all of those teen books and they put them in their own section outside of the kids section. And suddenly teens started grabbing them and reading them. Now, during the era when I was growing up, probably some things such as Sword of Shannara, David Eddings, some of these novels, Tamara Pierce, that we read as just being in the fantasy section, probably would be targeted as YA books nowadays. It's a really hard dividing line in true epic fantasy because something like Sword of Shannara, you're not going to set it in school. It's going to be more of the whimsical adventure, but it's going to be a more adult-themed whimsical adventure. You're losing a bit of the whimsy and adding more of the angst. And suddenly you end up with a YA epic fantasy instead of a middle grade epic fantasy. And that kind of bleeds over into adults. So we do have like 5 or 10 minutes left. So we'll just go ahead and quickly talk about adult divisions, and maybe we won't get into it in depth and then save it for next week. But basically what we got going on in science fiction fantasy, someone can tell me if I miss one, but we've got kind of what we call epic fantasy, right? We have what I will call heroic. This isn't the only definition. Okay. We have urban. Those are the 3 big divisions of fantasy right now. Am I missing one? I mean, we've got some little sub ones, but that's kind of the big 3.
Where do you put steampunk?
Steampunk would be one of the minor divisions. There's like 5 people publishing steampunk novels, so it's not. I mean, it's cool, but it's not. It's not a major literary division. If anywhere, it probably goes in urban. But all right, in science fiction, we have. I'll go ahead and do it down here, so I don't have to. In science fiction we have military. We have space opera. And we have hard. Those are your basic ones. Over here we'll put dystopian. This is more of a subgenre in YA right now. Hunger Games, Uglies, Maze Runner. Oh no, it's the future and everything sucks. And by the way, the kids have to do everything. That's kind of dystopian right now. The trend. But it's got a grand tradition. 1984 is dystopian. But let's we'll talk about these. Epic fantasy. Epic fantasy is the large cast, world building focused. Yeah, world building focused. That's what that says. Larger than life, meaning worlds at stake. You basically all know what epic fantasy is. I don't have to tell you that, but this is kind of the core of what epic fantasy is. As a new writer, shoot for 120 through 150K words. Okay, that may seem short. Elantris was 250. People were not willing to read Elantris because it was too big. Okay, it was really hard for me to get published. If your book is naturally 250,000 words, write at that length. If you can get it to 150 instead, do it. I promise you, it will be much better for you in the long run. You can get longer later on once you have an established track record. One of the big reasons for this is they can't charge any more for your book at double the length than they can charge for someone else's book. If they've got a book at 120K and a book at 250K, on the shelves, those are both basically, particularly from a new author, going to have the same price. But it's going to cost them way more to produce the big one. So you can see why they're hesitant to take the chances. New readers also are more hesitant to take chances on the bigger books because even though if they like epic fantasy, you're making a big commitment. And that leads to the second thing, suggestion for you writers is write it as a standalone. With sequel potential. QUEL. Meaning, for your first book, don't try and do what Grandpa Tolkien did, unless you really have to. Don't stop in the middle. Okay, he wrote that as one book and they split it, so it's unfair to him. But you don't want to have a book that just kind of ends. You can do that when you're established, where it's really just part one, but as a newer writer, you want that book to have a smash tie-up ending, which resolves all of your major plot threads, where then you can go on and you could see where it would go more if people wanted to read more. That's going to be really helpful for you in getting published, okay? And in getting readers. So, heroic fantasy is dudes with swords. I say that amusingly. This is the kind of gritty fantasy. It usually has a smaller cast.
Is this like Conan?
This is Conan, or modern examples, The Blade itself, Joe Abercrombie's books, or R. Scott Baker, David Gemmell. This is still a very viable genre, but Conan is kind of the granddaddy of this. Tolkien is the granddaddy over here, and C.S. Lewis is the granddaddy of the middle grade whimsical fantasy. Conan is the granddaddy here, though you may also say Edgar Rice Burroughs was the granddaddy, because these are Edgar Rice Burroughs books too.
George R. R. Martin also.
George R. R. Martin is actually a hybrid between these two. Okay? Other people have tried it. No one's really pulled it off like he has. I would definitely call him a hybrid, but I'd actually say he's closer on the epic fantasy scale. He's just borrowing a few of the tropes over here. But yeah. Moorcock. Michael Moorcock is a great heroic fantasy writer. Elric and things like that. These are shorter. You're looking for 80 to 100K. You're looking for a smaller cast. You're looking for lots of action. Even if it's a thoughtful book, like Elric books are, you're generally looking for lots more motion and action, movement. That doesn't necessarily mean every chapter has to be about hacking someone's head off, but every chapter should be moving somewhere. You aren't standing around having political conversations like you are in epic fantasy. Epic fantasy readers will forgive you for that. Heroic fantasy, not so much.
Is this kind of like R.A. Salvatore's like Drizzt book?
R.A. Salvatore is heroic fantasy, definitely. Yeah. All right. There's going to be blending between these, but these are kind of your basic genres. Urban is chicks in leather, kill demons. Okay. Sometimes they don't wear leather, such as Buffy, though she did sometimes. So there's an entire genre of this. The YA version of this is kind of Twilight, but not really. That's its own thing. That's more paranormal romance. Urban fantasy, also called dark urban or paranormal, is basically, Dresden Files. Even though he's not a chick kicking chicks in leather, there's a lot of chicks in leather in this genre. But Dresden Files is a good example of this. This is our world with a dark underworld. This is very popular right now. There's a lot of wide spectrum in what's going on here. You've got things that are a little bit more humorous, like Kitty and the Midnight Hour. Anyone read those? They're very fun books. It's about a woman who runs a radio show. She happens to be a werewolf, and it's for paranormal people to call in and stuff. But they're often mystery-style plots. And they tend to be really fast-paced. We're talking like 70K with thriller pacing, meaning an explosion at the end of every chapter kind of stuff, okay? So that's urban. We had some people who were writing urban, didn't we? Anybody? Nobody's writing urban. Okay. It's not really as much a BYU thing, but, you know, Dresden Files. Anyone read Dresden Files? Dresden Files are kind of fun. They get a little bit too graphic for me, but they're really well written. So, military is what it sounds like. Space Marines. Yeah. If you could read the book and say Space Marines, yeah, that's military science fiction. They can be also very thoughtful books. They tend to revolve around big space battles that are realistic. They tend to skew more realistic. Jack Campbell's written a fantastic series of books like this, and you know these are the books where you'll have these big space battles, and you know they have to like wait like 15 minutes for their torpedoes to hit because they're crossing such massive space, and then they have to wait 15 minutes, you know, or like 5 minutes to find out if they did hit for the light to travel back and stuff like that. Like whatever. It's things like that, but it's lots of cool Space Marines. Honor Harrington. Anyone read Honor Harrington? Oh, you guys haven't read widely in the genres. What are you doing in this class? Go read books. Yes.
Classify James White.
I haven't read James White. Tell me about James White. What is it? Oh, come on. Honor Harrington is the #1 best-selling military science fiction books in the world right now.
It's sci-fi, but it's based on an intergalactic space station. I mean, hospital space station.
Okay. House in space.
But less drama.
But less drama. It's gonna depend. There's the thing about there's so much bleeding. I don't know where I'm sticking. I'm just trying to give you like the general things. Yeah.
Where would you put Firstborn?
Firstborn is faux military science fiction. It's really space opera masquerading as military SF. One of the things about military SF, to pull it off well, you kind of have to have a military background or a lot of familiarity with the military. A good story about this is Elizabeth Moon was wanting to write military SF, and her books weren't selling until they put "She's an Ex-Marine" on the back of her books, and suddenly they started taking off. That may be the reason, but it may not be the reason. That may just be an apocryphal story, but it's pretty realistic in military SF. Space opera. Adventures in space. The thing is, putting this online now, everyone can like read how terrible my spelling is and stuff. Adventures in space. Space opera is your kind of catch-all. It's not really military because military, what type of gun they're using is really important in military. Okay? In space opera, it's a phaser, and we just shoot it, and people die. Space opera is all of your Battlestar Galactica, Star Wars, your fun space adventures. It's kind of your catch-all. If you're not worried about the hard science fiction, and you're not really worried about what type of gun you're shooting, it's probably space opera. Space opera is a very marketable genre that not a lot of people are writing right now. I don't know. Well, I mean, I can theorize on it. Science fiction tends to sell worse than fantasy, and so a lot of people have jumped to fantasy. The one reason might be I've heard people say that during the 90s, all the really serious science fiction writers all moved to writing hard SF, and a lot of the readers then didn't like the hard SF, and so they jumped to fantasy because there wasn't a lot of space opera, but there still is some. Simon Green writes some. Timothy Zahn, yeah. And you know what you see a lot of right now is kind of this space opera that masquerades, that puts on a serious mask and kind of pretends to be military. Old Man's War is this. He says it's military SF. It's really space opera. And Firstborn, my novella you can read online, it's really space opera masquerading as military SF. It's, Ender's Game is a hard one to define. I don't know if I would put it anywhere specifically in here. What Ender's Game really is Hoosiers in space. He took the underdog sports team story. And then when we were talking about taking plot archetypes, he put it in space, which is brilliant, made a great underdog sports team story in space, and then put around it this framework of this nice twist plot of a military science fiction book. So it's kind of like an underdog sports story nestled in a military SF.
I'm going to hold my question until after you define hard SF.
All right, okay. Hard SF. This is written by people with PhDs. I'm joking, but this is kind of what I'm talking about the archetypes. I'm giving the silly Asimov. Yeah, Isaac Asimov, Arthur Clarke, Ken Stanley, Robertson, Red Mars.
Yeah.
Robinson. A lot of the modern SF writers, I mean, there's still plenty of space opera writers too, and I think it's underexplored, but a lot of them are doing this kind of stuff, hard SF. They sometimes are branching out a little bit more, and there's a big argument of whether social hard SF is really hard SF or not. But you're getting into just the science is important. The science is very important, and it should be accurate, and it's an extrapolation of what happens if this scientific thing happens. Where would we go? Arthur C. Clarke, invented the geosynchronous orbit in his books. And this is the sort of stuff that hard SF people are doing. Okay? Yeah.
Are there specific word counts for all the sci-fi?
Oh yeah, I should be putting that up. Usually in almost all this SF, you really should be shooting for this kind of 80 to 100K range for pretty much everything. Okay? Anything can go longer if you have a good justification for it. Military, I've rarely seen go longer. Space opera I have, but I think it's a mistake. Every space opera I've read at longer than that has been a bad idea, except unless it's something like A Fire Upon the Deep, which is kind of like more a space epic fantasy, or Dune. Hard SF, you know, I don't even know what those people are doing, because, you know, sometimes they'll be so thick. I mean, the Red Mars books, they're mind-blowing, but they're so thick. And so, yeah, hard SF is probably the one that can go the longest, but it's more like it has a range of like 60K to like 200K. And it's just basically whatever the story demands. There's not as much of a market force upon that. Okay, so defining where your book is. The nice thing about this is, mostly this is for considering your audience, because all of these things get shelved. Oh, dystopian. You know what dystopian is. In adult, it's like Philip K. Dick type stuff. Or it's, you know, 1984. It's still very popular. And then we have like little things like steampunk and cyberpunk and stuff like that. But really everything gets shelved together. And so understanding what your genre is going to help with who are you writing it for. Are you writing this for my friend Ethan when he reads the books, really wants to know what kind of gun they're shooting? And if you get what type of gun they're shooting wrong, it ruins the book for him. If you're writing military SF, there are a lot of people who read military SF that's really important. Or if, you know, you get the way the officer interaction with enlisted men thing wrong, it's going to ruin the whole book for him. Space opera doesn't care about that. Star Trek, they're like, everybody's an officer. We'll just do that, except for Chief O'Brien. Sorry, Chief. You're like the only enlisted man in all of Starfleet. You know. But there's like no rules about fraternization. He's just called Chief because it's fun. And they wanted to come up with a reason why they could call him Chief. I mean, you know, that sort of stuff does not fly in military SF because it's trying to extrapolate real military people in space. But at the same time, military SF has this undertone of Space Marines, yeah! You know, this like, we're going in with guns blazing and we may all get cut to pieces, but yeah! You know? And so you've got this kind of weird mix in military SF of be really accurate, kind of have some of these little hard SF things, but only when applying to the specific tropes that you're working on, and have the focus be on the characters going into battle or whatnot. Or if you're Heinlein, going to school. It's a really, Starship Troopers, weird book. Fun book, but weird book. It's not about Starship Troopers, it's about Starship Trooper School. So, you know, knowing what these kind of tropes are going to help you target it to your audience. If you're going to be writing, you know, heroic fantasy, and knowing what the trends are in heroic fantasy right now, it's going to be really helpful for you for selling. When you go to that editor and they say, "What's your book's like?" You can say, "Oh, it's kind of, you know, Joe Abercrombie-ish." You can read those authors and say, "It's kind of like this, but it has this cool element of my own." Rather than saying, "Well, I'm going to reinvent the wheel and start explaining from the beginning," and you've already lost them, when you could have just said, you know, it's like such and such thing, or it's, you know, it's a heroic fantasy, it's got really good sense of grittiness, and it's about, you know, 10 people, you know, standing on a wall defending against 4,000 million troops, or whatever. It's like 300. By the way, David Gemmell made an entire career of writing like books that are like 300, with, you know, dark, gritty men, you know, who have hearts of gold, standing on the wall defending against people who are also dark, gritty men who have hearts of gold, and they all fight and kill each other. That's, you know, it's like every one of his books. They're awesome, but it's like that's how he wrote his books. So knowing these things are going to help you. And this is why I kind of tried to split you up into the divisions I did when I put you in your writing groups.